Without further ado, I'm going to call this debate to order on Resolved, Guns Keep People Safe. And for our first speech in the affirmative, we will go to Mr. Aaron Wolf. Aaron, go ahead and unmute. You have 4 minutes.
Thanks, Madam Chair. And first of all, I just want to stipulate what you just said. Of course, we're all appalled by innocent people dying. I'm coming from this. I'm super blue. To my apologies to my red friends, I've never voted Republican. I'm an academic. I live in a blue state. I'm as liberal as you get on just about everything. And I'm an ardent believer in the Second Amendment and the liberal protections that it brings. And so I wanted to talk to that. The question isn't, do guns keep people safe? Of course they don't. But in our world with more guns than people, do more controls keep people safer? And I would argue no, and I would argue there's a very liberal argument to be made for why we need access to weapons and the harm that controls do. So first, let's talk about what we call gun violence. We tend to conflate lots of things together. 45,000 people die a year. 55% of those are suicides, and we're not anywhere near the top in the world suicide rates. You wouldn't argue that places like Japan or Sweden that have much fewer guns. You can't argue necessarily that we'd have fewer suicides with fewer guns. Most of the rest are murders, people who know each other, and the ones that really grab the attention and the anguish, actually very few cases where people with long guns are firing on masses of people, accounts for about 40 deaths a year. So so these are the things that we think we're controlling, but as a liberal, I would argue we follow the science like we insist for climate change and for COVID and so forth. The argument that most of the modern gun control started in response to Black Panthers patrolling against police violence in Oakland. And still till today, most of the control measures have a disproportionate impact on Black communities and communities of color, where people are either disproportionately being denied permits in cities like in California, or people are disproportionately being impacted by having a gun because once upon a time they had a drug arrest. So the only way they could protect themselves and their families was to have a gun without a permit. The largest growth now in people buying guns are people who don't feel they have protection from the police, people of color, and women. These are biggest growth in people who are buying guns, and the kinds of control measures go precisely after the most law-abiding people. So imagine now a woman who has been abused, maybe has a stalker, and her school is a gun-free zone. She won't bring a gun because she's a law-abiding citizen, but her stalker will show up because he knows that she's there for a soccer game or whatever. For my perspective, I want to just share a bit of a personal kind of awakening I came to after Charlottesville, Unite the Right, where I saw masses of Nazis marching past the synagogue. And the people who showed up to defend the synagogue were vets who just showed up with their ARs simply out of the goodness of their heart to protect the synagogue. And at that point, as a Jew, I thought, oh my gosh, this could happen here. And it's about time that we collectively as a community started to think about how we protect ourselves. So the same as we protect ourselves against earthquakes, against any other kind of disasters, those of us who are liberal and are interested in protecting the rights of the powerless ought to be advocating for precisely the kinds of things that Congress has been moving us in the direction, combinations of mental health issues, background checks, making sure people who are in a place to hurt themselves or others get the help they need, but making sure that people who want to protect themselves and their families get the weapons they feel they need as well. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, very good. Jazz hands for our brave first speaker. All right, yes. Are there questions? This unorthodox and interesting speech. Oh, and just to let you know, the way you ask a question is you raise your Zoom hand, and that's listed on the bottom. So good. Let's start with Kevin Shumway. Mr. Shumway, go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Yes, I joined late, so I apologize if I do this the wrong way.
It's okay.
My question is, why is it, or how is it different in the United States than, for example, Britain? Why are they getting better gun violence numbers there, even though no one has guns?
All right.
Yeah. So again, I think I would separate out gun violence from violence. It's easy to say with fewer guns, we'd have less gun violence. The question is, with fewer guns, would we have less violence? And so that's where I don't know. Like I said, in terms of murder rates, the United States is 45th in the world. Plenty of countries that have fewer guns have higher murder rates. People find ways to kill themselves or kill others, whether they have access to guns or not. So I think focusing on gun violence is a bit of a misnomer. We ought to be focusing on violence and asking ourselves, how do we have less violence overall? Because that ideally is the goal of our society.
Very good. All right. Carrie Webb, go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Madam Chair, I'd like to ask the speaker, does he believe that every American should have access to assault weapons?
Right.
I can't say for every American. I can say for myself, I think I explained a little bit why I feel the need to have access to an assault weapon myself. And I feel the need, there's a non-zero chance that society breaks down enough where you would need a weapon like that. And so my sense is, if you look at how many of these are out there and how many are used in crime and in violence, I don't even know. It's an absurdly small amount that are used in crime and violence. And it's just, we have a very small chance of having a massive earthquake here in Oregon. And I would personally prefer to have access to something like that I end up not needing, than the rare chance that I might need it and not have access to it.
Alrighty, and for a final question, we will go to Alan Falk. Alan, go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question was to the speaker who responded to that last question about assault weapons. And I'd like him to say a few words, maybe take a few minutes to dispel the idea. What is an assault weapon? It's not defined anywhere other than in mass media. Can he comment on that, please?
Sure. No, like I said, I'm a combat vet, and I know what an actual assault weapon is, a fully automatic weapon. But I think we have a sense. Long guns that are repeat fireable, that are semi-automatic, that have big magazines, and I mean, we know. I mean, I appreciate needing to make the distinction, but I think all of us, none of us want to see people walk into classrooms or supermarkets or schools with these big guns that have a lot of rounds available to them. So I'll pass. And when there was an assault weapons ban, there was a legal definition. So I'll leave it to the lawyers to define it. What I guess I would just answer the one question, and I think it's a fair question. People ask regularly, why does anybody need something like this? And I think that's a question. Just about everybody I know has a bigger car than I think they need, or more house than I think they need. And so I think the question is not, why does anybody need something like that, but by what right does anybody have a right to say they shouldn't have it, especially when it's a right guaranteed in the Constitution? So again, I think most people don't necessarily need it, and far and away the vast majority of them are not used for ill activities at all, and so. Yeah, so I would just hope that we can work towards a world where the need is lessened rather than focusing on trying to take things away from the precisely from the law-abiding citizens that do follow all the rules to get their background checks, to do the permitting and the training and so on.
All righty. And with that, our first speaker is thanked. One more round
Thank
of
you.
jazz hands for good questions. Yes, absolutely. And good answers. So for our first negative, we will go to Mr. Hale Powell. Mr. Powell, you have 4 minutes. Go ahead and unmute, and you can dive in.
Unlike Aaron, I actually wrote something up. My name is Hale Powell, and I'm retired. Eileen Blue. My job tonight is to question the proposition that guns keep people safe. Self-protection is a legitimate human need, but can we make it safer? Can we reduce the unwanted side effects that maybe, on balance, endanger our families instead of protect them? First, a few personal tidbits relevant to my own personal gun experience. I spent a good deal of my childhood in the rural South and was perfectly comfortable with the presence of my grandfather's shotgun and deer rifle in the closet. I even joined the NRA and enjoyed target practice. I was a pretty good shot. In my mind, the issue of personal safety and guns is making our country more efficient by means of reducing the waste of human lives. How can we protect our families with the least possible negative impact? How can we be safe without the many tens of thousands of firearm suicides, murders, and accidental deaths and injuries a year? To keep it simple, let's just talk about firearm deaths. Firearm deaths are a fixture of American life. There were 1.5 million firearm deaths between 1968 and 2017. That's higher than the number of soldiers killed in every U.S. conflict since the Revolutionary War in 1775. The 45,000 total gun deaths in 2020 were by far the most on record, a 43% increase from 2010, when gun ownership per capita was approximately 50% less. Are we as a country safer because of an additional 100 million guns in our homes? Suicide by family members and the mentally ill have long accounted for the majority of U.S. deaths, gun deaths. In 2020, 54% of all gun-related deaths in the U.S. were suicides, while 43% were murders, as Aaron mentioned. In my view, increasing gun available did not make the 24,000 suicide victims any safer. And the question is, who is safer with guns? We live in an incredibly innovative world where creative solutions to virtually any problem seem to be available on Amazon or at Home Depot. We no longer have to dig ditches by hand. We have backhoes. We no longer have to wait for bank hours. We have ATM cards. We have surveillance cameras inside and outside our homes. We now have airbags and anti-lock brakes on our cars. Since 1960, we have reduced our per capita rate of auto fatalities by 50%. Can't we do the same with firearms? What are the few of the alternatives that would reduce suicides, murders, and firearm violence while still allowing us to protect ourselves?
You have 30 seconds.
What policy should I have 30 seconds? Okay. Okay. Let me just go to my conclusion then. Okay. In conclusion, rarely is there a single simple solution to a complex problem like gun violence and personal safety. In an innovative and creative country like ours, there are many alternatives for protecting ourselves without relying on ever-increasing gun ownership. Let's look at the experience of other countries. Let's start slowly controlling this epidemic that kills too many of the innocent and the vulnerable. Let's start by installing airbags and seatbelts to make us all safer on the road.
Sorry, I was muted. Jazz hands for our excellent first neg. Are there questions for the speaker? Let's start with Jonathan Jenkins. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to ask of the previous speaker what they think would have happened to Ukraine had they only had pistols and shotguns to defend themselves.
All right.
I don't think with Mrs. Chairman, I'm Chair, I don't think we're really talking about national security in this conversation. Obviously, arms are described very differently in warfare between countries. There's drones, there's artillery, there's fighter jets. So I think that's a bit irrelevant to this conversation. I think we're really, with all due respect, I think we're really talking about personal protection, which is what's in the Constitution. The Constitution really does not define national security for other countries. So I think I would respectfully say that that's not a question that's really relevant to this discussion.
Can I fix my question, Madam Chair?
Sure, go ahead and try.
In the Second Amendment, there is the right for the people to keep and bear arms to regulate a well-regulated militia. That's to defend, most people arguably use that to defend us against an invading power, which is why things like China and Russia don't come over and invade us, which is why I'm stating that I think that guns are very important because they defend us from other countries. Question. Yeah, so the same question, but now you have the context of why I laid that question and how it pertains to this topic.
Okay. Well, I would respond to that. Oh, Madam Chair, I would respond to that by saying that the arms that we have that are allowed under Supreme Court regulations and tax policy are completely inadequate to protect ourselves from an invasion. We aren't allowed to have machine guns. We're not allowed to have nuclear weapons. We're not allowed to have private fighter jets. So I don't believe that the Constitution and the current laws as interpreted by the Supreme Court are really relevant to an international invasion. I don't think that even if everybody in this country had an assault weapon, we would have no chance to fight against offshore submarines and cruise missiles and hypersonic weapons.
All right. And for a further question, we will go to Alexandra Gellin or Jellin. Go ahead and unmute, ask your question to me.
All right, Gellin, yes, you got it the first time. Hi, good evening. Mr. Powell, what do you think about gun buyback
what does he
program?
think? Yeah.
Yes. Oh, am I unmuting? Yes. What do you, Mr. Powell, think about?
You just have to ask it to me. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I want to know what he thinks about gun buyback programs as a way to control guns in this country.
All right. Great.
I would say that that's probably probably not feasible in this country, not politically palatable. It has been in other countries. Apparently, it's been somewhat successful in Australia, and I just heard that the city of Houston is started that sort of effort. But I personally wouldn't advocate something like that at this point until people feel safer. I think we need to get people feeling safe before we start taking guns away from them. And I did miss a certain part of my speech because I was too verbose, but I think there's other intermediate steps we can take that can make people feel safer before we start being more heavy-handed. I also think the gun buyback should be something that is decided probably by a local community rather than some sort of federal fiat.
Mm-hmm. All righty, very good. And with that, our first NEG speaker is thanked. Jazz hands. Yep, very good. Excellent. So we will now move on to our second affirmative speaker, who is Paul Norris. Mr. Norris, go ahead and unmute. You have 4 minutes.
I'd like to start by just recognizing the caliber of the preceding speeches and my deep respect for what you had to say. I'll just kind of briefly tell my story. I didn't really grow up in a family with guns, but I learned to shoot in the Boy Scouts, and my father bought me my first .22 rifle when I was like, I don't even know what age it was. It might have been 9 or 10, I'm not sure. I'm rigorously taught gun safety. My best friend became a doctor. And so in about the 1990s, he started telling me about all this medical research and how I should get rid of my guns and, what a horrible thing it was that I had them. And I actually reviewed all of that research, or at least a lot of it, and I read counter arguments. And to me, this research was just bogus, totally bogus. Holes you could drive a semi through. Interestingly enough, he and I took a trip through the Northwest together not so long ago, and I was carrying a gun legally. I have a concealed carry permit from Arizona that lets me carry in a lot of the United States, not California by any means. And he was just fine with that. So I guess, I hardly know where to begin. There's so many things to say, but I guess, first of all, do guns keep people safer? Hell no. It depends on who has them and what they use them for. It's not the gun per se, it's who has it and their orientation to the gun. So, but I consider that an affirmative for the purposes of this speech. I would ask you to recognize that we have been systematically miseducated and given false impressions of guns. And one example I'll just give is, if you're not really a gun person, you don't know the difference probably between a semi-automatic and an automatic. And you probably think that, people like I have guns like the ones that you see in the movies, blowing away concrete bunkers, et cetera, et cetera. Not so. So I ask you to be open to consider that you have been miseducated and to learn from a different perspective. I think the evidence is really clear that concealed carry by honest citizens is not a problem. By the way, not a high percentage of people will actually go for concealed carry. And they tend to be people who are not afraid to apply for it, who are basically good, safe people. So it actually makes things safer when somebody like that is carrying a gun. And most of the time, the purpose of having a gun is not to shoot somebody, but to display the gun and prove that you are not an easy victim so that they can change their mind, turn around and go the other way. The last thing I want to address is why the public health approach is not really, it may have something to say, but it is not the be all and end all of how to do research into guns. First of all, doctors hate guns almost uniformly for good reason. They see gunshot wounds. So they pretty much see everything bad. They don't get to see what's good. So they start out very, very prejudiced in their research. And the way that the research is done is actually very, very superficial. They count dead bodies and see how many of them have gun holes in them. A more sophisticated research would look at quality of life. And let me just give you an example. Let's say you have a serial rapist who has raped over 100 women, doesn't need a gun, may not even need a knife, may just be able to do it because of his size and strength. That's not gun violence. That doesn't show up on their studies. And if he kills a woman, she fights back and he gets pissed off, he kills her, that's not gun violence. But if she has a gun and she shoots him and kills him, that is a gun homicide that is carried in the statistics as an example of what we have to get rid of. So that's it, I'm done. 20 minutes over, thanks for your largesse. 20 seconds over.
20 seconds, different. Yes, jazz hands, absolutely. Yeah, and thank you for acknowledging the caliber of the speeches who came before you. I can't help myself but notice that little pun there, but anyway, but yeah, I appreciate that. And you are totally correct. This is already going very well. Are there questions for the speaker? I see several already. Wonderful. Let's start with Jeannie Moriello, or Jean, perhaps. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Yes, Madam Chair, I wanted to ask the speaker a question related to a comment as part of his presentation. Mm-hmm. I think the comment was people wanting to carry guns so that they could display the gun, so that people would feel that that person was not an easy victim and would turn around and walk away. My question is, what about circumstances where people want to display the guns because they want to use it to intimidate people that disagree with them politically, or they have a different skin color, or they wearing a t-shirt for a political party that person doesn't agree with, or they want to speak up at a school board meeting and somebody doesn't like what they say, and people want to use displaying guns to intimidate others?
I consider displaying a gun to intimidate somebody else from using their own right of free speech as, I think, I'm looking for a word that's strong enough, and I'm really not quite coming up with it. How about anathema?
Great.
So in other words, guns should not be displayed to intimidate people from free speech. They should be displayed to intimidate people from committing violent crime.
Sorry.
Okay.
Unfortunately, we can't do responses, although if you have thoughts, definitely chat your whip about speaking, because yeah, I think there's a lot here. Let's go with Chris Weaver. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Hi, Madam Chair. The previous speaker, and in fact, both speakers for the affirmative, have talked about following the science and dispelling misinformation. And I hope that's something that I can really be educated on tonight. So I'd like to ask the previous speaker who talked about a gun as a means of defense. Actually, both speakers did. Are you aware of this? Any statistics in terms of people who defend themselves using a gun, how successful they are, whether that actually was successful at deterring violence?
Yeah, happy to answer that. So it's interesting that in the 60s and the 70s, a lot of gun research was done by criminologists. I would give you the name of Gary Kleck, who was a criminologist who interviewed criminals about their experience. And there are others, FBI statistics. I've seen FBI statistics for certain years that talk about, how crime is stopped by displaying a gun. Most of the recent research has been taken over by the Public Health Initiative. And I consider this a problem, again, because It's not sophisticated research. It doesn't look at quality of life. And, you know, meaningful research in my mind in the social sciences should not just count bodies, but it should recognize that there are people who wreak havoc in others' lives. And we need to deal with that.
All right. And with that, the speaker is thanked.
But I don't get any more
Good
questions?
questions and you done. We do 2 per person, Paul, you know that. Alrighty, and with that, that is the end of our pre-planned speeches. So we're gonna open it up. And so let's go first. So I'm looking for a speech in the negative, and let's go to Keely Vanaker. Go ahead and unmute. You have, at this time, we will also shift to, no, I think we can stay at 4 minutes for another couple. 4 minutes.
4 minutes.
Go ahead.
Okay, Madam Chair, thank you for calling me to speak. So the first thing is, what I wanted to talk about was that prevention piece. And I hear that a lot when I'm hearing about this, that a gun is great for that prevention strategy because someone might see me with that gun or understand that I'm not as easy target, or that if there is, you know, people who are on a school campus that are armed, and if it's stated that they're armed, there's less likely to be someone who's going to come and do a shooting or something or crime. And so there's a couple of things why I wanted to speak tonight. So my father was killed at Fort Hood, November 5th, 2009 in the mass shooting. 13 people were killed, approximately 26 people were injured. And I look at that as a moment of what does that prevention really look like with that? Because you can say, can I honestly say that there were people in that room that had they been armed would have been able to react to him? Yes, maybe there would have been less death, but I don't see that as a prevention strategy, because what I've seen in a lot of situations, you can go to, if you look at mass shootings in particular first, you talk about Parkland, there was already, you know, like armed police officer there. You look at Uvalde as our latest worst example. You look at Santa Fe near Houston, 2 retired police officers armed and were ready to go and were there and actually targeted the shooter as fast as you possibly could, and he still killed 12 people. So when I look at this piece, I also think of it in terms of individually, because I am a gun owner. I am a gun owner, and I don't ever feel, not one time, that it is too much of a burden on me as a gun owner to say that I am a good qualified person. I'm not a threat to somebody. I am not convicted of a felony or a violent crime in my past. I have a lot of reasons to say that that is not an hindrance to me. And so when I look at that, and they are in a safe and they are stored for the very reasons that I have children, and also that I know that I am more likely to be killed by my own gun than I am to be using it against someone. But I don't own them because I think that I will actually be able to prevent someone from coming into my home. I know that if someone comes into my home at 2 o'clock in the morning and with a gun, for whatever reason they might have to target me for some reason, they have already decided they are more willing to kill me than I am going to be waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning ready to kill someone. The next part of that is that growing up in rural areas even, or growing up in, and I've lived in both cities and rural areas, I know that when I make a list of every person within a 1st or 2nd degree removed from me who has been injured or killed or wounded by a gun, and a list of people I know who have successfully been able to use a gun to protect themselves, there is not even a close comparison. And I'm not talking about a police officer reacting to a situation. I'm talking about, I had a gun in my home and was actually successfully able to ward off an intruder. I don't actually know anyone. And I'm 46 years old. And I've actually been at my sister's house in New Orleans when someone came in and we had an intruder and we had a gun. it didn't matter. He didn't try to shoot us. A dog barking and us yelling was enough for him to go at that moment. But had he not, he would have already been ready, more ready to shoot us than we were. And in top of that list that I can think of from the time that I'm young, from suicides to injuries to hunting accidents. I mean, just some things that if you live in a rural area, you understand that sometimes that is the nature of that horrible beast. It is much, much longer. So when I think of this debate,
Go ahead and
I think sometimes we argue between prevention and reaction, and it's not the same thing.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that with us, Keely. So jazz hands for the stories and the speech. Alrighty, questions for the speaker. Let's start with Avi Pemper. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Yeah, hello, Madam Chair. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yep.
My question for the speaker, maybe it has two parts. One is, why does she own a gun? I understand why, because I understood why it's not, preventative necessarily to own one. So why does she bother owning one and keeping it stored, locked up in a box? And the other question is, should we stop giving people the ability to drive cars? Because driving cars and accidents, I haven't looked at the statistics, but I imagine is killing a lot more people than any of these assaults we're talking about. And by the way, I'm not really sure why suicides are part of this conversation at all. I don't know why we're talking about suicides in this. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks. Go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, that's a great question. Why is it when I'm saying that I don't believe that guns prevent, are in general, I don't. One is we own guns because my husband likes to hunt. That's it. We don't have a lot of them. When he gets a chance to hunt, that's what he uses them for. They are not a priority as far as I think of them as a prevention for me to keep someone from invading my home, if that makes sense. The second part of your question, or third part, you were talking about suicides, and I'm glad you brought that up, because when we're talking about keeping people safe, and I know that there's this, I think that part of it, it's really hard to debate research, because you have to have research in front of you where we're comparing what the holes are. Lots of research is going to have holes. And lots of people who do research on this will tell you there's a hole in this because I can't get that information. Like they can't get information on homicides with kids because medical examiners don't call them the same thing in every state. But that said, suicides, again, even though someone might be choosing to take their life, in general, if they have access to a gun, they are more likely to do that than if it's not in the home. It doesn't mean they won't commit suicide at all, but it does increase that risk. And so, and the actual death is higher. They are much more likely to have died than if they had taken pills and thrown up, if that makes sense. I think I am missing part of one of his questions. So thank you, Ari. I appreciate it, Madam Speaker. So if I missed one part, I apologize.
It's okay. Yeah, it was a complex one. Good. So let's go next to Sandy Headley. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Madam Chairman, I would like the speaker to address actually two things. Number one is, and it's been touched on with the issue of suicide, right now in our country, guns are the leading cause of death in children, more than accidents or cancers or anything. And there's no requirement for safe storage of guns. So if the child grabs daddy's gun and ends up accidentally shooting himself, then daddy's not held accountable at all. So the same would apply to somebody that is suicidal, where there are guns in the home and nobody's required to keep them locked up. The second piece is, I live in Texas, and in Texas, the legislature passed permitless carry, meaning that you don't have to have a license, you don't have to have any training. If you can pass a background check, which in this day and age is unfortunately easy to do, you can go in and buy a gun and buy ammunition and walk around with a loaded gun with no training whatsoever. So is that something that the speaker would think ought to be part of our requirements for people to be carrying guns around. Thank you.
All right, go ahead. The first thing is when I do talk about kids is what I see in general is our gun culture for a long time. We really didn't have a lot of guns. I think people forget that 120 years ago, guns were really expensive and we really didn't have a lot of them. When I think of both my grandparents who lived in very rural areas and had a gun, you want to know how many they had when they died? One, and another set didn't have any at all. And so it's one of those pieces where our gun culture slowly started getting away from it being, we have to keep guns in a safe, and being this culture of, if you don't have a gun under your pillow, then you aren't safe at night. And that's the part where I see where that voice has become so much louder, because the more guns and the more people who are afraid of what's going to happen to them in the middle of the night, they forget the safety of what's actually happening in their home. So that's a cultural issue itself. I have a hard time with requiring every family to keep them locked down in a safe, only because you have these circumstances where, and I do think of it in the mostly rural setting, where it is hunting or the avidness of what you're doing is that that gun is part of the culture of your life. That doesn't mean that I know lots of people who live in rural areas who keep their guns locked up, who understand and train and make sure that their 5-year-old child is trained that you don't touch this without mommy and daddy around, and they don't leave them lying around with a 5-year-old just sitting there. So that's the difference of, you have this gun culture of families where that really were raised like guns are serious business. This is not a toy. We don't play with this. This is a serious thing. And a gun culture of people who have now have that expectation that, well, I need one everywhere. And if I don't have ready access to it, then I'm going to die. The odds that your child is going to use it to kill themselves or someone is much greater than you are going to be invaded in your home. And that gun is successfully being used to defend you. The last piece, I think you were talking about, Carrie, I absolutely think I live in Texas too. Wrong. I don't think anything of that was constitutional at all. Wrong. I'll just say that way.
That was concise.
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
Yes.
Awesome. With that, the speaker is thanked. So jazz hands once again. Very good on all counts. And we will go to our next speech in the affirmative. And so let's go to Jonathan Jenkins. Go ahead and unmute. You have 4 minutes.
Bear with me, guys. I haven't done a speech in a long time. So I'm going to skip the Second Amendment since I already addressed it earlier. This can mean different things to different people, but I would like to point out the fact we, the people, having the right to defend ourselves against tyrannical government and an invading country or a person wishing to do us harm. Thus, these are things that keep us safe. Think of what would happen to Ukraine if they only had pistols and shotguns to fight off Russia. Gun control laws do not deter crime and only affect law-abiding citizens. I would like to point out that cities like Chicago have no legal gun shops or shooting ranges in city limits, as per Chicago City Ordinance Section 2-3, a city where all semi-automatic and ghost guns are illegal, yet it has had 971 shootings in the first 5 months this year, and they are projected to hit 2,330 shootings by year's end if it doesn't ramp up. 2.6 million people live in Chicago and 2.4 million people live in Houston, Texas. That's an 8% difference in population, yet Chicago has 310 homicides and Houston 187 in the first 6 months this year, which is a 40% difference. Even with guns control, there is more crime in Chicago. What about printed guns, and how do you plan to stop that? Switzerland has the highest rate of gun ownership, where there is, or high, sorry, which is 2 million privately owned guns with 8 million population, and yet the last mass shooting was in 2001. Gun control will not prevent criminals from obtaining guns, and what I just stated before shows the possibility that guns are the reason that there is less crime in Houston or Switzerland. Guns are just a flavor of the insane right now, but I know that there is worse out there. I know people want to ban ARs that shoot a 5.56 round that tumbles and is designed to kill one person and not penetrate through other people. When no one talks about a semi-automatic shotgun that holds 12 rounds, shoots 12 ball bearings for 144 projectiles, just because it's not scary looking. There is worse killing power in a suicide vest filled with ball bearings. What about a U-Haul or a truck like the terror attack in Manhattan that killed 8, or in Berlin, a man with a tractor purposely crashing it into a Christmas crowd, killing 12, or a man in France who drove a 20-ton truck down a crowded beach, killing 86. These people would just crash their vehicles into crowded areas and kill more people than any of our mass shootings. What about the man in China who stabbed 17 people with a knife, or people who can create explosives like the Boston Marathon bomber? The point is, if a person wants to do evil, they will do evil. Society needs to change, or together good must stand against evil. I am personally sick that people have the audacity to say, don't you think kids are more important than your guns, which of course is an argument used against one party from the other that wishes to take something away from the other without ever thinking what they would give up to save children. In the military, there's a term for level of force used to take an objective, which are called soft target and hard target. Soft target is a target that is unarmed, no combatives. Hard target is an armed with combatives target. Almost all shootings occur in soft target locations. How do we fix this? Should only one party give up their rights? How come all these mass shootings stop, whether by death or suicide, when the insane meet a reactive force? How come these mass shootings don't happen in heavily armored compounds? Are the kids not worth protecting? This very week in Greenwood Mall, an armed Good Samaritan killed a shooter in a mall after the shooter killed 3 people and would have killed more. He had 2 rifles with multiple magazines. What would have happened if that gun was illegal and that the Good Samaritan didn't have it? The point is, in all of that all this, guns aren't the problem, people are. We need our guns to defend ourselves, and they're a very important part of our constitutional rights. I'll sign a document right now to vote for slightly more gun control, i.e. 21 age limit, stricter background. When the other party is willing to sign, they will no longer erode the Second Amendment from this day forward. They always say that they're not here to erode the Second Amendment. They always say it's just this one thing, nothing else. Yet look at California, where they went from no automatics to no 30-round mags, to no 14-round mags, no 12-round mags, no 8-round mags, no star chambers, really quick. I think, and they're already planning more regulation on guns. Gun control is a slippery slope, ultimately aimed to ban all firearms from all people. Guns aren't the issue. Guns save countless lives and protect countless people. That's the end of my speech.
Alrighty, very good timing, and jazz hands. Thank you so much. All right, are there questions for the speaker? Let's start with Keely Veneker. Since you just spoke, I'm curious. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
So I'm going to address it with the tyrannical government question, because when I think of our government as a whole, when I think of what we were talking about as people using a gun against a tyrannical government in order to prevent them from being tyrannical, to stop what they're doing, I can't really think of an incident where that worked. I think of Trail of Tears, where they were armed. They were a whole nation of people. The Supreme Court came in and said that the president was violating the Constitution, and yet he did it anyway and was successful in doing that. I think of Tulsa, Oklahoma, where a judge actually released the kid who had been arrested and felt he had been wrongfully accused. They went with their guns to the courthouse to get the kid and walked away. And yet the people of that place formed the government and used planes to throw bombs on that area of the city.
It sounds like a very good speech, but could you ask the question?
Yes, so my question is, who gets to define tyrannical government, and how does that look? Because you have people now who have decided that it is tyrannical to tell women they cannot not have an abortion. How do you define tyrannical government?
Great. All right.
Thank you.
Sorry. Okay.
I would identify a tyrannical government as Britain and how they impeded on the Highlanders, or Ireland, or the United States when it first founded. And I think that it is no better of an example than we fighting off Britain's creating this very country we live in and can have this conversation as proof that guns defend and protect us against a tyrannical government. I also would like to point out the fact that our Ukrainian brothers over across these seas right now are fighting for their lives and defending their country. And if it wasn't for the guns that they're getting from us daily, which aren't just pistols and aren't just shotguns, but fully automatic weaponry, weapon of war, they would have been burnt in the ground week 1 as per our military chiefs have announced and said. And yet look at them now. They've been holding them off for, what is it, 3-4 months now, 5 months now, that they've been holding off because of guns. Guns are a perfect proof of themselves, of their ability to fight a tyrannical government. Just think about our country's founding.
Alrighty, and then we will go to Ilana C. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
I'm curious, Madam Speaker, what the speaker's opinion is of the Dickey Amendment.
Okay. If you don't know
I'm
what
sorry,
that is,
I
no
have
shame.
I have poor hearing. I have like military ears, so I'm sorry. Can you restate the question and actually maybe
Yeah, if you would just explain it,
Madam Chair?
Ilana, that would be great for anybody who doesn't know.
Sure. The Dickey Amendment was passed in the 80s by the US Congress, which limited all funding on gun violence so that the ability to research guns, gun activity, gun violence, anything to do with guns has been very, very, very hampered by anybody who has an interest.
Okay.
So just to confirm,
What does he
so
think
there
about
was
that?
a bill that was passed that made it to where it's harder for people to research gun violence. Is that what that basically is? If that's the case, I'm against that. I think that any research is good. I think anyone can agree with that. Anyone that would go against that, I wouldn't understand. Also, I'm sorry, guys, if I seem high strung. I haven't done a speech in a while, and I noticed there's 165 of you. Last time I did this was 30 people. So.
Well, jazz hands. That's actually our point anyway. So jazz hands for good questions asked and answered. And that's, yeah, we love it when people haven't given a speech in a while or are first timers or any of that. So thank you so much. And with that, we will move to a speech in the negative. And we're going to go with Alexandra. Is it Gellin or Jellin? I'm not.
You got it the first time, Gellin.
Gellin. Okay,
yeah.
Go ahead. You have 4 minutes. Go ahead.
All right. So yes, this is my first time too. So I wanted to speak on the issue of psychological safety, since I imagine that's not what most people think of when they think of safety, whether guns keep us safe or not. But as a mental health professional, that's where my mind goes to. And my talking points really come from personal experience, as well as like my personal feeling experience, as well as the experience I have working with young people, and their own experience with the way they feel, and the way we feel about living in a society where guns are so prevalent, and where the idea of having armed teachers is a scary thought, and the idea of needing a gun to be safe in our society is just not a thought that makes them feel any safer. Certainly doesn't make you feel safer. My experience, of course, is that I grew up in New York City, where guns were heavily, up until recently at least, heavily controlled, thank goodness. And so I grew up without seeing guns. I grew up without knowing about gun violence personally. My first experience with gun violence directly was when I was waiting in line at the Atlanta airport, and all of a sudden we had an active shooter situation for which we all had to run out of the airport. The entire airport was locked down for 2 hours. So this was maybe thousands of people that were locked out of the airport. Their travel plans were disrupted. So much fear and terror because a gun misfired, because someone was, stupidly and illegally holding a gun in their luggage. So there actually wasn't an active shooter situation. But I'm telling the story to speak to the fear and the disruption that guns cause in everyday life, and why we would benefit and feel much more psychologically safe if we had fewer guns in our regular life. Now, I understand the value. I really do appreciate joining this conversation and hearing the different viewpoints and understanding that there are definitely opportunities when having a gun and when having armed personnel around you can protect us. And just considering how in our day-to-day lives, feeling the need to be armed creates such a state of anxiety that makes it very uncomfortable for most of us to be around, and literally so much anxiety that I have children who don't want to go out in public, because that particular client of mine actually was at the airport as well that day. And since then, she's basically had PTSD from that experience. So that is my rationale for why guns do not keep us safer. They do not protect our psychological safety, which I would say is really important, because the way we feel on a day-to-day basis impacts the quality of our lives. And by living in the richest country in the world that supposedly is the freest, I would like us to have a greater amount of psychological safety and be able to say that we can live and sleep without having that fear and not having to need armed guns to make us feel safe.
All right. Very good. Thank you. It's a new and interesting approach. Okay. Move to questions. We're going to start with Willis Duncombe. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
I may be making a mistake here in that I don't so much have a question as an observation that.
So right now we're only doing questions.
Well, am I supposed to be asking for Alexandra? Is that the idea?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Alexandra.
But you have, sorry, you have to ask it to me. So Madam Chair,
I'm sorry, Madam Chair, I'm
is,
sorry. I'm from the country. We didn't have any chairs there.
I'm sorry. Keep going.
My question is really based on her statement, and it raised a question for me, and that is, what about people that didn't grow up in a safe part of New York, but in fact lived in a really rough area of New York? I'm wondering how in the world they would feel about that kind of comment.
It's a good question. Yeah, go ahead.
That is a really valid question, Mr. Duncombe. And I recognize the privilege that I grew up with. And I also, so I obviously I cannot speak for people who grew up in places where there was gun violence and they did hear gunshots out their window at night, which certainly does exist even in New York City. But from what I have read and what I have heard and what I have spoke to, because I've also worked in parts of Atlanta where there is more gun violence and there is more low-income families and people who, basically there just is a lot more gun violence. And from what I've heard and read in articles about people who live in places where there is a fair amount of gun violence and, children and people are bystanders get killed by gun violence, I've heard that they're absolutely in fear and that it's terrible and that what I read a lot and what I hear a lot is that people are in fear for their lives. There was an article in the New York Times recently about this, a young man who lives in a neighborhood and he used to be involved with a gang, and this idea that he feels fear for his life every day because of guns, because bad people with guns who have them illegally might be after him. And having a gun just doesn't make those people feel any safer. Certainly not when, a baby in a car seat was killed inadvertently by a gun. So for people who live in neighborhoods where there's lots of guns and there's lots of gun violence, they don't necessarily feel safer having a gun because the gun violence is so prevalent and the stray bullets are so unpredictable that there's really nothing you can do. I mean, I've read too many articles about children who've been killed by stray bullets. And that's just, there's nothing that can protect you from that. And that, as a mother, as a person who works with children, that breaks my heart. So that's my answer to that.
All right. Good. And then we'll do one more question from Mark, Sari, or Carrie. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to ask Madam Chair, how does disarming law-abiding gun owners make you feel more safe?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because basically those are the people that are going to be affected by gun laws. Your criminals buy their guns on the street for the most part. So how is disarming law-abiding gun owners going to make you feel more safe?
Right. Mm-hmm. go ahead. Oh yeah, there you go.
That's certainly a fair question. You know, I asked about gun buyback programs earlier. And so I am generally in favor, and this is me being an idealistic New Yorker who has never, you know, been in warfare, but as an everyday normal citizen who has never had that experience, I personally feel that I would feel safer knowing there are fewer guns on the streets in the hands of regular people. Now, I understand that our militia are very well regulated. Our military has all the guns that they need to protect our country. And that does make me feel safe on a regular basis. I am grateful that I live in a country where we have an incredibly well-stocked militia, and they can defend us in need. And I don't think everyday citizens need to have that in a civil society where, for the most part, we don't live in neighborhoods. Yes, so another article I read recently was that most of the gun violence that actually occurs in cities occurs in a really small, like square mileage of those cities. Unfortunately, neighborhoods that have a lot of gun violence tend to have it in a concentrated area where there's high poverty, where there's lots of issues going on, and it doesn't expand to most places in those cities. So I personally don't think I need to carry a gun to make me safer. Would I feel more safe if less people were carrying guns? Yes, because I also feel like
we need to wrap up.
Yeah, I also don't necessarily think we need to take all the guns away. I think we need to increase, like countries like Austria that have really safe gun laws and really like low gun violence. We need to improve training. We need to we need to make the gun laws more strict so that it's harder to get a license, so that you need a permit to carry it. So if you want to be a law-abiding citizen to carry your guns, you can, but you need to go through the hoops to get it.
All right, and with that, the speaker is thanked. Jazz hands once again. Yes, good questions asked and answered. Okay, so we're now going to shift to 3-minute speeches, just because there are quite a few folks who want to speak, and we'll get as many folks in as possible. So I would now like to go to, for an affirmative speech, Rec LeCount. Go ahead and unmute. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the folks who spoke before. So my name is Rec. I'm from Atlanta. I live in Atlanta. I'm a gun owner, as is my husband. I grew up around a lot of guns. And the previous speaker actually reminded me of a conversation I had at Yale with a friend of mine when we were talking about guns, and he asked, if your kids went over to someone's house, how would you feel if that person had guns in the home? And I said, that was my childhood, and I would feel a lot safer if I knew my kids were over someone's house with a lot of guns. He could not understand that response. I couldn't understand his view at all. I thought his view was insane. And I kind of like that there was that back and forth between the previous speaker and one of the questioners, who basically put those two things in part together, because ultimately a big part of this debate is that there are very different cultural worldviews that a lot of folks are coming from, where there are people who genuinely feel unsafe around guns, and there are people who genuinely feel safer around guns and deeply concerned about people who are anti-gun and about the policies and the regimes that flow from being anti-gun. And so what I want to talk about is two things. One, I do think guns make you safer, not the least of which because, estimates about how often guns are used in self-defense ranges anywhere from 70,000 to 500,000. We don't really know. The data is really squishy for a lot of reasons that people have said before. But the point is, it's a lot. And there are a lot of folks who know people, myself included, who have used guns to defend themselves. But at the same time, there are a lot of folks who have been victims of gun violence. And sometimes those people are the same. There are a lot of folks who support defensive gun use because they've been the victims of gun violence. But where I think the conversation can actually be very productive is to think about the ways in which we can respect the right to bear arms and respect the right to carry arms, and also find ways to reduce harm. And I think it's important to do that for the simple fact that, as the first speaker said, I think it was the first speaker, the guns aren't going anywhere. We have 400 million guns in this country, and guns are forever. If you stopped selling guns today, the guns that exist on the streets would still be here in 50 years, 60 years, however that is, even ignoring the black market, even ignoring everything else. You can't just get rid of the guns. And obviously, as it goes without saying, the folks from whom you would want most need to take those guns away are the least likely to give you those guns if you try to come for them. So one of the solutions, I think, is to focus on what my friend or one of my favorite people, David French, talks about, which is people control. If we can't necessarily get rid of all the guns, which we can't do, we can talk about what kinds of people we allow to have access to those guns. And that includes things like red flag laws, that includes things like robust background checks, that includes things like ensuring that the background check apparatus can see everything it needs to see, which currently it cannot. Actually, now it can because the laws have changed. But in the past, if a juvenile committed a very heinous crime, their record is sealed at 18 for reasons that may or may not be good. And therefore they could buy a firearm. Now that is not necessarily going to be the case. So having systems in place that allow us to prevent dangerous people from getting guns does two purposes. One, it allows us to block off the people who are causing the problems. And two, it allows us to not infringe on the rights of people who are not causing the problems, which acknowledges both that, yes, we do have a problem with guns, but also we have a problem, but also the vast majority of people with the vast majority of guns out there aren't causing those problems, and that therefore we can find solutions that acknowledge that there are people like the previous speaker who will never feel comfortable or safe around guns, and there are people like myself, both of whom are in Atlanta, who fundamentally do feel safer with guns, fundamentally do want to live in a household with guns, and fundamentally think that that is a indelible and important part of who we are as Americans and our fundamental rights as human beings. And with that, I'll yield to questions.
All right, jazz hands. The second Atlantan in a row. Probably we should just go there to have this debate next time. All right, are there questions for the speaker? I see Jeffrey Tobin. Go ahead and unmute, ask your question to me.
If you can understand me, then that's a good, Madam Chair. Just to highlight the fact that we have a lot of intelligent people here, I am speaking Russian right now. So if anyone understands me, then that means you're particularly intelligent. I'm just kidding. Look at your face. Okay.
I understand. I'm not one of the smart ones. Yeah.
Oh, no, that's not the case. Okay. So I'm interested to know your perspective on his perspective on this. I believe that, and especially after hearing some of the previous speakers, Mr. Wolf at the beginning, Mr. Jenkins, I believe that the gun issue is an issue of a symptom and not the actual problem. Now, the reason I say that, and I'll put this in a question form, is because when we look at the science, as Mr. Wolf talked about at the beginning, when we look at the science, Madam Chair, it turns out that the places where there is so much gun violence, very frequently, maybe most of the time, have the most laws controlling guns. So that's one issue. Second one, of course, is that in other places, they have very few laws, and they also have very low gun murders and those kinds of things. So what the problem seems to be, according to the American Psychological Association, is that where most of these things happen are in places where there is higher education, where there is high employment, even though in reference to Alexander a little bit ago,
this is super interesting. I do have to make you ask a question, but go ahead.
Okay, so that's the case there, and in these other places where we realize that the gun laws don't seem to affect. My question is, if I were to ask, how is it that if guns are a symptom, as I believe that they are, then how do we deal with the real root problem, which I believe is issues of psychological well-being, feelings of lack of power, people who are frustrated with things that are going on? That seems to be the root of these issues. And whether our guns,
so how do we deal with that?
Are guns really the issue, or is it something more challenging?
Yeah, I thank the gentleman for his question. I think that in addition to the people control that I was discussing earlier, it's important to have robust healthcare systems. So I know we passed laws here in Georgia that are aimed at promoting mental health. I know the federal government has passed a few as well. And there isn't really a silver bullet to like mental health, like people say that. I think you have to work at various aspects of the culture. You can work at, better education, people, better jobs, infrastructure, all the parts of the infrastructure that explain why higher income, well-to-do folks like many of us on this call tend to just not only do well, but not make certain types of decisions. And that's like a generational argument, but I do think that in addition to the short-term people control, you do have to do that longer term, play the long game to put people in better positions.
Wonderful. Also, you guys have got to stop with these like silver bullet, like I can't help myself. You're killing me, so to speak. Anyway, Mr. Wolf, go ahead. You're next. Go ahead and ask your question to me.
So much. Yeah, no, I love what the speaker said, and also the approach of looking for ways of commonality and to find shared values. I guess my question for the speaker didn't identify his politics, and I guess I'm making a leap by assuming one way or the other. But one of the issues I've noticed in kind of around gun dialogue is it's kind of hard to be a lefty who's in favor of gun rights. The gun community is virulently anti-left as a whole and can be pretty nasty about it. And likewise, the left can be pretty nasty about guns. And so I wonder, the speaker's approach is really powerful. And I wonder where on both those sides, both the lefties and the gun people, how do we pull these people together and approach them both in a way that we can have the kind of dialogue that he's advocating? Thank you.
I thank the gentleman for his question. So to clarify, I'm a red, but I grew up around a lot of reds and blues. And the benefit of being Southern and growing up in the South is I know a lot of blues who are pro-gun. That's kind of the norm where I'm from, actually. And so what I think often happens, I'm also a member of the National African American Gun Association, which is based here in Atlanta and is like promotes firearm ownership among Black and brown folks. What I think it actually comes down to is just going into spaces and having conversations and being aware of where different folks are coming from. NAGA, which is a weird acronym, but it's doing that pretty well. The NRA actually does it. I'm not an NRA member, I used to be, but the organization doesn't do it very well, but their community does. When I used to live in the DC area, the most diverse places I ever would go repeatedly and consistently were always either NRA spaces or gun ranges or gun shows. I think I said a lot about how accepting the culture is once they understand that like you share a certain degree of values. So I think part of it just comes down to one, going out there, talking with folks, understanding where they're coming from, and just being willing to have conversations and being willing to being very clear up front that you take gun safety very seriously. And I mean gun safety in the real sense, not in the gun control euphemistic sense. Because once folks realize that, I've noticed in a lot of situations where people's entire orientation towards you change and they feel like there's something deeper they can relate to you about, and that allows you to therefore have more productive conversations about other things.
All right. Wonderful. With that, the speaker is thanked. Jazz hands. Yes, yes. I love this, you guys. This is going really well. Thank you for making it that way. We are now looking for a 3-minute speech in the negative, and we're going to go to Mark Beckwith. Mr. Beckwith, go ahead and unmute and ask your, excuse me, you have 3 minutes.
Yeah, we're going to watch the recording. It's better that way.
Oh, I'm sorry. Mark Beckwith.
Thank you. Thank you, April. Thank you all. My name is Mark Beckwith. I'm a founder of Bishops United Against Gun Violence. And a week or so ago, I did a podcast led by Kieran O'Connor and on guns. And I'm going to do one again with Paul Norris, who spoke earlier today. And I don't want to talk so much about guns, but want to talk about fear. And Jeffrey Tobin mentioned that there's something beneath this issue about guns, and I'd say it's fear. And a story that I tell is after the Parkland shooting, I gathered a bunch of kids together in the diocese where I served, and one girl said, she was walking down the hall with her friend and said, well, if the shooter comes, will you drape yourself over me, or do I drape myself over you? And they were kidding, but they weren't. And they were scared. And we're all scared. Everyone is frightened, and we respond to the fear in different ways. Some think, oh, I'm going to get more guns. That will deal with the fear. Keep guns away from people. That will deal with the fear. My problem with sort of the proliferation of guns is from my experience, and again, I'm not a gun owner, I haven't fired guns since I was in Boy Scouts, is that guns, to my mind, are fear transfer machines. That if somebody approaches you, you respond to them with a gun, firing them, that takes away the fear for the moment. But my experience is that fear just metastasizes. And where we are now in this gun debate is the people who are looking for more gun safety legislation and people who are resisting it, not only are dealing with the fear that gets them to come up with their position, but they're fearing the other side. And so I think that we need to deal with the issue of fear and acknowledge that we're all carrying a bit of fear. And some people feel safer if they have guns. Some people feel less safe. Martin Luther King, after his house was firebombed, got a gun, and afterwards he gave it up and he said, the time that I was most afraid is when I had a gun in the house. So there are lots of different feelings about this, but the fear is the fundamental component of all this that I think Braver Angels has the capacity to deal with it at that level.
Wonderful. I think the speech is over, but we're frozen. Yep. Okay, great. You were frozen for a second. Sorry. Wonderful. Okay, jazz hands. Yes, absolutely. Folks already did it, but one more time. Great. So questions for the speaker. Let's start with Mr. Jenkins. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Madam Chair, thank you for this opportunity again. I would ask of the previous speaker, because I know he's talking about how, you know, people aren't feeling safe with guns. I would like to point out again that what happened at the Greenwood Mall, where a Good Samaritan saved countless lives, because again, the guy had 2 ARs, one in his backpack. He had, I think it was like 10 magazines fully loaded. He was there to do a bad deed. And because of a Good Samaritan, he was able to stop that. I would ask of the speaker what he thinks about that with pertaining to what his speech was.
Well, I think the shooter should have never had the gun, an AR-15. I don't know that it's necessary. One of the things that could, I think, move the conversation, and I'm hesitant to offer it, in these latest mass shootings, particularly the one in Uvalde, where the person used a semi-automatic rifle, kids' heads were blown off. And there's a desire on the part of some people in the media to show those pictures, but that is dishonoring.
Mark, maybe you should turn off your video. We're getting a little bit of choppiness. All right, we'll wait just a second and see if the signal comes back. Bishop Beckwith.
There we go.
Yay. Maybe
All
turn
right.
off your video just so that to minimize the
Yep.
chance that, yeah, okay. So finish your answer and we'll do one more.
Yeah. Again, you know, the focus is on the guy who shot the shooter. I think the focus should be on the guy who did the initial shooting. He killed 3 people. He should not have been in that position. He was young. He bought it legally. And here's yet another story of somebody who's young, who's filled presumably with a level of fear or self-importance, or needs to deal with his lack of masculinity, and so he goes out and shoots people. This has been happening over and over and over again, and I think the fear of dealing with that is one of the big problems of that we're facing.
All righty, very good. And then for a final question, we'll go to Paul Barnes. Mr. Barnes, go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, great. Very quickly, some numbers have been thrown out by other speakers, so I'll come back with a couple of numbers myself. The number 400 million firearms in the United States. I know that about 45% of the households in the United States actually own firearms. I know that there are about 20 million AR-15s that are a part of that 400 million. And again, 45% of the households in America own firearms. So the issue for me is not who's getting killed, although that of course is the issue for all of us, and I shouldn't say it's not for me. The concern I have is,
This is a question, right?
yes, the why, yeah, thank you. What does it say about the safety of our government? And as I'm in favor of the Second Amendment, but what does it say about the safety of our government when we're not having conversations with the gun owning households about how to use these firearms safely? We're not a threat. It's so we can work together with this. We're not having those conversations. We're having conversations about why we need, why it's you, why it's them, why we need firearms. So my question is, what about the safety of the United States and our democracy? And is the United States a tyranny or is it not? And if it is, and that's, I think, the issue that we're all getting really uncomfortable about is we're concerned. Is our country safe? There's 20 million AR-15s out there owned by 45% of the households. And I think we can all identify those of us who are in favor and those of us who aren't in that set of circumstances. So my question is, are we safe as a democracy?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think there are lots of ways to come at that question, but what often happens is when we get into these conversations, and there's less of it tonight than at other times that I've had conversations around the issue of guns, is that we get to an either-or situation. The Second Amendment or not the Second Amendment. People should have guns or people should have no guns. That is not a helpful way of looking at it. I think we need to look at the level of fear. What I'm hearing you say is that there's a fear level among people that we're moving to a tyrannical form of government. I don't share that feeling. I know people do. I want to talk about that level of fear and understand it. I want to hear about it. My visceral response is, no, that's not the case. But there are more and more people like the person who's asking the question who feel that way, need to come to terms with that. What's that about? How do we talk about that? What typically happens is one side shames the other, or is self-righteous or arrogant, and then people double down, and then we're just shouting at each other. Is there a way to get at that? And I think it's really what you're talking about, a tyrannical government. There's a level of fear in that question. My level of fear is that more and more people have guns. Kids have access to guns. Young people are getting guns. AR-15s are in the hands of people who use them as weapons of mass destruction, really, as we're hearing. How do we talk about that fear? How do we get at that? And we typically just sort of end up talking about we should have guns, we should not have guns. And that's a fruitless argument.
All righty. And with that, the speaker is thanked. Jazz hands. Once again, I feel like the questions and answers in this debate have been really good too. So as usual, we don't have as much time as I wish we did to hear every single argument and point. At this time, we'll move to 2-minute speeches. And I think I'm going to have to, well, we'll see if we can do questions really fast or else we'll not do them. So I'm now going to move to a speech in the affirmative, and let's go to Steve Galante, or Gallant. Go ahead and unmute. You have 2 minutes.
Yeah, you got it right this second. Galante. Mostly it's a speech in the affirmative, but just to kind of clarify, there was a lot of questions about self-defense. So the CDC did a study back in 2008, and it's estimated that 1,029,000 plus individuals use guns every year in self-defense, excluding those in the police force and in the military. Of those people, 162,000 said they almost certainly would have been killed without their firearm to protect them. So that kind of goes toward this, I mean, we do have a number of murders, but it's far outweighed, and this is the CDC. I mean, we're not talking about the NRA, we're talking about a government group. To put it in perspective, the average homicide gun-related death per year is 11,208 as of 2008. Back in 1907, people were able to open up their Sears Roebuck catalog and order a semi-automatic rifle that had more power than the AR-15s of today. Basically, it was a gun that you can order. They got shipped by the US Post Office and got delivered to your house. So, I mean, we've had guns for similar to AR-15s, or the power of an AR-15 for a number of years, over 100 years. There was a person, I believe, from Atlanta that brought up the New York State Supreme Court decision. I live in New York State. It took me 12 months to get my concealed carry permit to carry my pistol. You go through a federal background check that's through the FBI. Now, once you have it, the next time you go to buy another pistol or a shotgun or a rifle, they still run a FBI background check. Now, are those perfect? No. And one of the reasons they're not perfect is because things like mental health are not always part of that. Now, I don't know how much of that HIPAA.
Let's get a wrap up.
HIPAA plays into that, but I mean, that could be part of it. So, I mean, there's a lot of reasons. I was out, my 18th birthday, me and my brother were out going out to a bar. Someone pulled a knife on us. My brother opened up his coat jacket because I wasn't old enough to have a pistol. He had a pistol under his jacket. And amazingly enough, the guy ran. They pulled the knife on us. So in New York State, as a concealed carry permit holder, I'm not allowed to show my gun. If I show my gun, I can get arrested. So
all right,
it isn't that easy. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, the speaker is thanked. Jazz hands. Yes. And I've realized that if we do questions, we will never get through everybody. So we're just going to keep going. But thank you for that.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to go to a 2-minute speech in the negative from Danielle. Danielle Eleonora Crone Giffrey. Go ahead and unmute. You have 2 minutes.
Hi. I am a pacifist and a Montessori preschool teacher. I believe that we can and should create a world where children and adults can and should learn to resolve conflicts with effective communication and conflict resolution, which I teach the children every day. I know there will always be guns, but I am a visionary, and I can imagine if there were no guns, then no one would have to use guns to protect themselves against guns. I practice martial arts, Tai Chi, Muay Thai. I can protect myself from almost any weapon except a gun. Imagine instead of guns, we had slingshots. Could I kill myself with a slingshot by accident? Could a 5-year-old kill herself with a slingshot, or bring a slingshot or a bow and arrow to their kindergarten class and kill another child? Does a 5-year-old even know what a bullet is and what it means to be shot or to shoot someone? No. Could an intruder or a man on the street get my slingshot from me and know how to use it well enough to kill me with it? Likely not. If I had a gun in my purse, yes, I am more likely to be killed by my own gun and shot because I show my attacker that I have a gun. How many unarmed citizens whom armed officers thought had guns who didn't were shot? A gun is way too easy of a weapon to use. It's an unfair weapon. I have been attacked by a policeman over a custody issue. If the policeman who attacked me thought I had a weapon, I would probably be dead right now. I had seen the movie Crash, and so I knew exactly what to do to show my hands. Can a small child pull a trigger? A small child can pull a trigger easily. I dare say he or she could figure out how to use a slingshot or a bow and arrow or a knife. What are the chances a bow or arrow misfires? From how far away could a killer with a knife or a bow or arrow or a slingshot hide to kill another person? How fast could they recharge their bow or arrow with a slingshot or knives? And to finish on a humorous note, if my primary weapon of self-defense is a slingshot, I can find ammunition quite easily if I am attacked. And as far as I know, stones are free. I can make my own slingshot. I do not have to spend my life savings on ammunition or support any large companies.
All right. Thank you. With that, the speaker is thanked. Yes, slingshots. Interesting. Hadn't thought about that. We'll next go to a speech in the affirmative from Stephen Metz. You have 2 minutes. Go ahead.
I'm from Vermont. Vermont has no licensing requirements. And in Vermont, one can carry a loaded weapon, concealed or unconcealed, any place, anytime, anywhere, except for schools and public institutions or establishments where liquor is being served. Other than that, one can carry a concealed or unconcealed loaded weapon. I carry a weapon infrequently, but I do sometimes because I am unwilling to be a victim. And unfortunately, in the old days, quote unquote, if a man came up to you and said, "Give me your wallet," and you gave him your wallet, you were okay. That was it. But nowadays, you are just as apt to be stomped, killed, slashed, or shot. So it's no longer the same world that we live in as we used to. And I want to call attention to the danger of quote unquote gun-free zones. What better invitation could we possibly have for someone that has nefarious intentions than to tell them that there will be no method or no possibility or probability of someone resisting with a significant weapon. And for my final point, and I do want to say that I feel I should have the right to walk down the street. If I lived, God forbid, in New York, I feel I should be able to walk in Central Park without terrible fear. So the speaker who said that mentally it was not a good thing, I disagree. I think it can make me feel much more secure. But I would advocate for better training for people that do carry weapons.
All right. And with that, the speaker is thanked. Jazz hands. Yep. Very good. All right. We're going to do a speech in the negative. And I don't know if we'll actually quite get to everyone, but we're trying. So for those who don't get to speak, my apologies. Come back next time. But for the next speech in the negative, we'll go to Anthony Rosasco. Go ahead and unmute. You have 2 minutes.
Hi, thank you. I'm a lifelong gun owner and someone who served in the military. And so it may seem a little strange for me to be speaking in the negative, but I've had guns around me and owned guns my entire life. My father's gun rack was in my room growing up. The guns were unsecured. And the reason that I'm speaking here today is because even though I enjoy shooting sports, I shoot skeet, I shoot trap, a lot of the both handgun and long gun sports that are out there, I participate in. And I just want to make it clear that even someone who owns guns doesn't necessarily believe that guns make us safer. And I grew up in New York City, now live in New Jersey, so I've always lived under tight gun regulations. And what I can say is that even in those kind of situations where, you know, guns aren't as prevalent as they are in other places, that escalation and lack of training, I think, are two of the things that scare me about having the average citizen walking around with a gun. Most people, even that are into sports, you know, if they don't train regularly, aren't as rigorous about safety and the use of deadly force in particular. One quick story: I was in a bar 30 years ago. Young guy gets into an argument with an older guy. The young guy pulls out a knife, lunges at the older guy. Turns out the older guy was a retired cop, pulls out his pistol, deflects the knife, hits him over the head with the gun, trying not to kill this young kid. Well, unfortunately, when he hit him over the head with the gun discharged and killed the kid at the end of the bar who was just sitting there having a drink. And this is a trained police officer. That combined with the fact that I've seen escalations happen where, you know, somebody would get into an argument with 2 or 3 guys in a bar, and seeing he was outnumbered, normally would have left. Well, now he's got a gun on him and he ain't leaving. And I've seen situations like that escalate to the point where Someone was dead and they didn't have to be. And had there not been a gun there, they'd have walked away. So even though I enjoy shooting sports, I enjoy having firearms, I don't think that they necessarily make us safer. And one quick thing too, I've got a 15-year-old daughter who stopped my heart the other night when she showed me about a dozen videos on YouTube about how to pick any lock out there, including my gun cabinet. So she could open my gun cabinet in about 30 seconds without a key. So for those of you that think you're safeguarding your weapons out there, go on YouTube and do a little research. And I guarantee you, whatever safe you have can be picked and can be opened by any kid who wants to spend a little time on YouTube. Those are some of the reasons that owning a gun doesn't necessarily make me feel safer. Like I said, I still own guns, but we'll continue to own guns. But I don't think that they necessarily contribute to our safety. And I don't think the answer to violence is potentially more violence.
All right. With that, the speaker is thanked. Jazz hands. Yeah. I want to commend the body, you all, on all the stories and really sophisticated points that have come out tonight and the way that we've blended them together. We're going to go ahead and do our sort of formal adjournment, but don't leave because we'll reflect a little for a second on just what the conversation was like tonight. And but first we are going to do the formal adjournment. So if someone would unmute and say, I move we adjourn, that would be great.
I move we adjourn.
Great. And I need somebody to say second.
Second.
All right. With that, we are adjourned.